Let's remove the wheel, 21mm socket. For the 14mm, let's remove these 2 bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. There's one, leave that in, just a couple threads so it doesn't fall when you remove this. Okay, now take both of these out. Just pry the caliper a little bit so that it squishes in the piston. Now you can remove it off of the bracket, slide it off the pads, and I like to just set it aside up on top here. That way it can't put any pressure on this hose. And now you can remove your old pads. There's one, there's the other. If they're a little bit more stuck in here, you can use a little pry bar or anything you have to help you pry them off. Now with a 17mm, we're going to come here and remove these 2 bolts. Those 2 hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle. Okay, leave this one in a couple threads. That's going to hold the bracket on while we remove the top one. Now take off the top one. This top one's out. Remove the bottom one. And here's your old caliper bracket. At this point, my rotor should come off, but it's seized. So I'm going to use a hammer in between the lug studs or from the backside, whatever's easiest for you. Just make sure you don't hit these, otherwise you'll have trouble putting your wheel back on. There we go. Take that off. At this point, I want to get all this rust off. You can use a wire brush if your rust isn't too bad. This one isn't, but I'm still going to use a little sanding disc to make it even better. But basically a wire brush will help you get in between the lug studs here. And what you're aiming for is just no raised areas, no flakes of rust like this, because you want the new rotor to sit nice and flush. So I'm using a little sanding disc. Again, like I said, you can use a wire brush. Now let's just clean this off with some brake parts cleaner. Get off all the old grease that might still be there. And then we'll apply some brand new anti-seize. That's going to help this situation not happen in the future. It'll prevent rust from building up. At this point, you want to apply some anti-seize to the surface of the hub. Try to avoid the lug studs as much as you can. Perfect. I'm going to put this rotor on. I like to put it on backwards first just so I can apply some brake parts cleaner and clean off all of the oil that's on here from the factory. They do this so it doesn't rust sitting on the shelf. But you want this clean. You don't want any oils to get on your brake pads. So now that's clean, flip it around, install it the right way, press it on all the way, and let's clean the front side as well. All right, now that this is done, let's get the caliper bracket ready for installation. Now with the caliper bracket on my workbench, I'm going to remove these anti-rattle clips, set those aside, and you want to clean underneath them. You can see it's a little rusty. You want to get all that rust off. If you don't, your pads that sit in here are actually going to get squished between the 2 ends, and after you're done applying the brakes, well, it won't release as well. So then you'll have some braking issues. You can use a wire brush if the rust isn't too bad. Mine isn't bad everywhere, but it does have some spots here that I would like to sand off, so I'm going to use one of these discs. I know this is not the greatest tool to use, but whatever you can get in here to basically scrape this rust off. Okay, that looks much better. If you are using one of these cutting discs, just make sure you don't press too hard on it because you don't want to actually cut into the surface. Apply some grease. A very thin layer is good. That's way too much. You just want enough to cover the bare metal, and you don't want too much because then it'll actually squeeze out and get onto the rotor. So a very thin layer is good. Like I said, just enough to prevent rust from building up. Now take your new anti-rattle clips, line them up, and they should press on all the way. Make sure they go all the way down, that's important. Now flip it over, and we'll do the same to this side. Finish up the other side. Again, make sure this goes down all the way. And now let's pull out these slider pins, and I like to do them one at a time just because sometimes, as you can see here, they have a little rubber piece, and you want to make sure that they go back into the same hole that they came out of, and well, they have the rubber piece for a reason. So clean off the old grease. Now mine wasn't rusted or seized in there. If yours was, you would want to either get new ones or sand it off or do something to get rid of the rust as well as in there. You can use a bore brush, which is just like a little brush on the drill, but mine still had good grease. So what I'm going to do is actually put a little bit of grease in this boot here. This will act as a little reserve of grease, and then I'm going to lubricate the slider pin. If you put a lot on the pin, it's actually just going to get wiped off by the boot when you go to put it in, so that's why I like to put it inside of the boot. And when you add grease to it, make sure you go up in that little ridge there. That's where the boot seals up, and the grease will just help it make a nice watertight seal. So slide that in, press it down all the way. And if you noticed, for me, it's actually gone in all the way, but if yours doesn't go in all the way and if there's a little air pocket stuck in there, press down on the slider, squeeze the boot, and usually that'll get the air out. Now, just do the same thing to the other side, and we'll be ready to install this onto the vehicle. Perfect. Let's line up the caliper bracket. Grab your 2 bolts. I cleaned up the threads on them just because they were a little rusty, and I applied some thread locker. If you're going to apply anything, make it thread locker and not grease or anti-seize or anything like that. You don't want your brake bolts backing out by themselves. You want them locked in there tight. So start those on. Let's snug them up. Okay, let's torque them to 79 foot-pounds. Let's get the brake pads in. The outer one has no wear indicator, and it'll just slide in here. Make sure it slides in smooth like this. The inner one, you'll have to attach the wear indicator to it, which is just this little tab. And you'll see on the back side, it has these 2 notches, and you pick whichever one is needed because these are for both sides, in and out. So basically, you want to set it so that the wear indicator is on the inner pad on the bottom. So for this, it would be right here. And the way it attaches is just like this, with that flat piece sticking out towards the rotor. So I'm just going to lock it in like that. Slide your pad in. Oops, this came off. All right, these are in. Next, let's get the caliper ready. And before we install the caliper, I actually have to press this piston back in because right now it's extended for the old pads. And to do that, I'm going to use an old brake pad, put it in here, and that gives me something to press on. At this point, you can either use some large pliers or a special tool, which is here. This is called a caliper depression tool, and what it does is, well, it pushes this piston right back in. As you do this, you want to go slow, and if it takes a lot of force to press this in, then you know that your caliper piston is seized and you need a new one. For me, it's going smoothly, so I'm just going to keep on going until it bottoms out. Again, make sure you go nice and slow. That's bottomed out right there. Remove your tool. Remove the old brake pad. And before I install this caliper, I'm just going to make sure that there's no debris in here. You don't want any rust or flakes of any sort. And I'm going to take a little bit of grease and just put it on the ring of the piston here. This is going to make the pads operate quietly and smoothly. And then I'm going to do the same to these 2 ears here. Just apply a little thin layer of grease for the same reason. There we go. Now take it, flip it over, make sure it's going the right way, and install it over the brake pads. And these slider pins, you'll see that they have a nice flat cutout here. That needs to line up with this part on the caliper. Once it does, it'll seat itself in. Grab the 2 bolts, start them on, and then we'll torque them to 29 foot-pounds. Sometimes these are a little tricky to start on, but once you get one, you can easily line up the other. Okay, let's bottom these out, and like I said, 29 foot-pounds. That's one. And the second one. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, torque them to 76 foot-pounds. All right, take it for a road test.